We have a very special edition for you. Our special guest is a multi-talented, multifaceted, multi-decade legend in the business, American musician, record producer, executive, best known as the music promoter of the Woodstock Festival held in 1969. Welcome, ARTIE Kornfeld.
Well,
Welcome,
nice to
ARTIE.
see you. It's
It
my
is so
pleasure to
great to
be
see
here.
you. And I
Yeah.
understand we're on the verge of a wedding. You are getting
Oh,
married.
yeah. Well, we don't have to go public with that,
No,
but
we
yeah.
don't. I'm just
Caroline,
congratulating you and your lovely
Caroline.
wife. That's all.
Well, I lost a wife and child in Florida years ago, but I've been with Caroline, who's from Greenwich, for we've been living in this house for 21 years. So we figured the engagement was long enough.
It's a mere formality. Artie, talk about first falling in love. Who were the artists? What led you to start making music, writing music, and wanting to be this your life?
Okay, I was living on Long Island in New York, and they had a program when I was in the fifth grade. And the program was, I love music always, you know. Uh, the program was that for $1, you could pick out an instrument and you get an hour lesson a month. And I wanted to be a drummer, so I went running over there because I wanted to be a drummer. When I got there was no drums, and all they had left was one trumpet. And I picked up the trumpet and I started to play it, and I practiced 3 hours a day. And that eventually in North Carolina, I wound up being first chair symphony solo trumpet player in the All North Carolina High School Symphony. And in the meanwhile, my mother loved music, my uncle loved music, and I hung with musicians. And I started to play jazz sometimes in trios. And I was a trumpet player. I didn't have a guitar. My guitar came was when Cass Elliot and I became friends in college, before the Mamas and Papas. After the Muglums, but we became friends at American University. And when I was in high school, I fell in love with a girl from another school who was like, I was a 12th grader, she was a 10th grader. But her father happened to be Lou Spencer, and he was the top choreographer for all the rock bands you saw on TV. And he was in a tap dancing group called the Dunhills. His partner was Bobby Roberts, who started Dunhill Records, because that was the name of their dance group. And I wrote a song, and I actually saved money. I went in the studio and I cut a demo, and it was 2 track. It was my first time in the studio, and I had it, and then I had to put it on a disc, and I put the disc. I gave it to. Okay, this is a crazy story. So now I'm in college. I go to Adelphi College. I pitch a perfect game against West Point in baseball, which I really did, by the way. I pitched a perfect game, and I was president of my class, the sophomore class, and I I want to keep going with my music. So I went to American. That's where I met Cass Elliot. We were both working in the cafeteria, and she had acoustic guitar, and she showed me how to play the chords I need to write. And I started to write, and it just was easy for me. It was like throwing a knuckleball. It was easy for me, and I started to write, and then I worked and saved more money to go in to do another demo, and I had $50, and I go in the city, and it was only 2 track in those days. Now they record 48 track. But I was part of the Goffin and King, Man and Wild, Lieber and Stoller. Those are my friends.
Yeah, the Brill Building.
Well, yeah, I came out of that. I was one of Donnie Kirshner's writers. I was writing with Goffin and King, and I hung with Lieber and Stoller, and Burt Bacharach. Those are all the people that I knew, and all the studio musicians. So I forgot where I was. Okay, so I went and I cut this demo. And then had left college, so I decided to go to night school at Queens College. Okay, and it was night, and they had a bell that rang, and then that meant another class was changing. And I had years before I had cut a demo, and I had the demo, and I was telling these guys that I lifted weights and played basketball with. I was telling them that I had a good friend named Charles Koppelman, who was just hired by Donnie Kirshner to run the music and publishing company at Screen Gems. And I read all the music books, so I knew Screen Gems was the hottest. Actually, Screen Gems was beating Motown for BMI awards every year because they had great writers.
Yeah, they had the
So I tell all
monkeys and
these,
all that.
oh, I produced Davy Jones before the Monkees, and I turned down the Monkees.
Okay.
I passed on the Monkees and the Allman Brothers. I'll tell you why. Because I stuck with the councils and then I let the rain the park. And then knocked the Monkees, Daydream Believer out of #1. So I felt I had done my job well. But it took me a year to write that song, the right song for them. So anyway, I'm sitting in Queens College and I'm telling these guys the bell rings, they all leave to go to class. And the guy sitting next to me, I had just been bragging about my friendship with Charles Koppelman. He taps me on the shoulder. He says, let me introduce myself. I'm Charles Koppelman, your best friend. And I went, oh my God, no. So we talked. He said, by the way, is it true that you really have a demo? I said, yeah, I have a demo. He said, well, I'll tell you what. I just started running publishing for Screen Gems. I'm with Donnie Kirshner. And why don't you come up and meet with me and bring your demo? And if I like it, we'll play it for Donnie. I went in the next day. I brought the demo. Donnie heard the demo. And I left there. I'm from a poor family. My father was a cop. I left there with a check from BMI for $500 and a contract for $125 a week to be a writer, advance against royalties. And that's how I got into the business. I
Wow.
started I started writing by meeting Charlie by lying.
Yeah. Of course, Charles ended up forming SBK and becoming a major publisher and record
Well,
label
you
and
know
all
what?
that.
You know what I did for Charles? Charles,
Yeah.
we go back a long time. We played on a softball team when he was 20, okay, on Long Island. Charles was an usher at my wedding, and it was Copeland and Rubin. They were both ushers at my wedding to my late wife. And I was just accepted because I started writing with Tony Wine, and I started writing with at the Alan Freed show, in New York. Alan
Yes.
Freed created the term rock and roll.
Yeah.
And I know that because I ran Roulette Records and I worked for Morris Levy.
Oh
Do you know
boy.
that he owned a copyright on the name rock and roll? And that's why for years nobody had the name in a song until it finally went through the courts. So
I remember
I
that
go,
John Lennon album he did for Morris was called Rock and Roll.
yeah, yeah. Well, I left Roulette when I wanted to. I took Charlie's place running Roulette, but that's further on. So the Alan Freed show's in town, and Jan and Dean are playing at the Alan Freed show, and they're staying in the St. George Hotel. So they said Jan Berry would like to meet you. So I went over, and it was a suite. It had a grand piano in it, and there was Jan. And if you know, I don't know, I guess you didn't know Jan because he got hurt and he disappeared. But Jan and I started writing, and the #1 record was My Boyfriend's Back. And Jerry and Carol and Man and Wild and Lieber and Stoller, everybody was trying to get the follow up because if you're a writer, if you get the follow up to a #1 million selling record, you're going to sell a 500,000, and that's how we got by in life by record sales. So I was lucky. The first song I wrote with Jan was the follow up to My Boyfriend's Back, was called I Adore Him, and it went to #8 in Cashbox and Billboard and Cal Rudman Street in those days and whatever. And Jen and I became friends, and then they flew me out to L.A. and then I got to be friends with Brian Wilson, and I was with Lou Adler. He was running the West Coast for Screen Gems, and I hung with Lou. I was with Lou the night he said, "Let's go to the Troubadour. There's a kid playing there. I'd like your opinion." And it was a blind Spanish kid, and he sang good. And Lou said, "What do you think?" I said, "I don't know. What's his name?" He said, "Jose Feliciano." I said, I think you should sign him. And we did. And he happened. And meanwhile, I'm hanging out with Brian Wilson because he was best friends with Jan, because Jan and Dean. In fact, Jan learned his studio technique from Brian learned from watching Jan, because Jan and Dean happened before the Beach Boys, when it was Jan and Arnie and they sang Baby Talk. Remember? That goes back.
Yeah.
So anyway, Brian and I get to be really good friends, and I'm hanging with Jan and Phil Sloan and Barry Maguire and the people in LA. And I go to Brian was given, when he wrote A Little Honda, the Honda Corporation gave him a little like 60cc little baby make believe motorcycle. And Brian and I hung out a lot, and we were riding in the motorcycle, and it went down. I said, Brian, we're in Santa Monica. We're going to go down. There's sand all over the floor here. And we went down. And so he took half the bike and I took half the bike. We were both bleeding. And it happened to be the street, 17th in Santa Monica, where his future mother in law had a house. So we carried the bikes bleeding up the street. And the house was empty. The lights were on, but no one was there. We put the bikes down and we walk in. And there's a blank piece of paper on the piano. And I pick up the paper and I walk over, and Brian sits at the piano, he hits a couple of chords, and I write down, I don't know why, I write down Dead Man's Curve. I have no idea why. I never said it before in my life. I didn't even know if there was a Dead Man's Curve. So I wrote down Dead Man's Curve, and Brian started to play, and the words just came real quick. He was sort of shocked. And what happened was, do you remember the song Dead Man's Curve?
Oh, sure.
Okay, well, we're playing, and I'm just writing it out right away. I was cruising in my Stingray late one night. Okay, I didn't have a Stingray. I was driving a '54 Chevy, but Jan had a Stingray. And and then I'm having to ask him. I decided to make this a race up Sunset. So I'm putting in, we flew past La Brea, Schwab's. I keep having to ask Jan, what street comes next? What comes next? Because I'm creating a race course. And then I say to Brian, all of a sudden, I said, Brian, stop playing. He said, why? I said, I want to put an accent in here. He said, what? I said, yeah, there hasn't been a good accident death song since I Want My Baby Back in the 50s, 60s. I said, I want to put something in here, so don't play it for like 8 bars, 12 bars. So we just stopped and we left it blank. And then I finished, and then I put then Jan came over and Jan put it in. The last thing I remember, Doc, I started to swerve and I saw the Jag fly into the curb. I'll never forget that horrible sight. I found out for myself everyone was right. You won't come back from Dead Man's Curve. Okay, that's that. The record comes out, goes to #1. And the strange thing is, Jan had an accent. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah, and it was weird because I'm in Florida at my house on Key Biscayne, and I get a call from Brian Wilson, and I go, Brian, what's going on? He said, Artie, how did you know? It was Brian. I said, what are you talking about, Brian? He said, well, where you had me stop the song, Jan had an accent, and exactly where you stopped the song. How did you know? I said, I don't know. It just came into me. He said, well, Jan had that accent you wrote in the song. I said, what? He said, yeah. He said, just where you put it in the song. And I didn't even know the streets. So I don't know. I didn't know a street. And yeah, he wrote his Corvette Stingray underneath a parked truck, and it cut off a third of his brain. And that was very heartbreaking because I love Jan. We were so close. When he came to New York, he'd come to my mother and father's house. We were good friends. And so that was that. And then after that, I was writing with everybody. I wrote with everybody from Bobby Fuller to Steve Allen. I wrote with a lot of writers. And I wound up with, I think, about 47 songs that made the top 100 in the trades. and a bunch that went top 20, and a couple that went number one, and then I had my demo of the song I wrote called The Pied Piper. And I had nothing to do with it. So what I did is I had the demo that I made with it when I was already running Mercury Records when Quincy Jones left. I was the head of music for Mercury, and I went in their studio and I finished the session and I had an hour, and in that hour we wrote the demo for the Pied Piper. We put the vocals on, the overdubs, everything, and I had that and I gave it to Compliment because he used to manage me and I forgot about it. So now the president of Mercury Phillips comes in from England, and he asked Charlie to come over and meet with him. And he says to Charlie, "Do you have anything to play me?" And Charlie had nothing on him, but he remembered that he had this demo in his attaché case. Stop. Stop. He said, "Excuse me, I got distracted." He said to the head of Phillips, he said, "I have the one demo," and the demo we had was my demo of the Pied Piper. And then there was magazine rack on the side coffee table, and there was a magazine called Changing Times. So the guy said, "I love this record. Who are they?" And Charlie looked down at the magazine and said, "Oh, they're the Changing Times, right?" Meanwhile, it was Artie Kornfeld and Steve Duboff, two writing partners, making the demo. And that was that. About 3 weeks later, I'm in a restaurant with my late wife and Steve and his girlfriend at the time. And the waiter comes over and said, "Are you Artie Kornfeld?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You have a call." And I couldn't figure out why because I was in a restaurant 50 miles from where I lived. And he said, "Someone wants to talk to you." And I get on the phone. He goes, "Artie, it's Charles." I said, "Hi, Charles, what are you doing calling me here?" He said, "Well, you're on the charts." I said, "Yeah, I have a rep around on the Delrons. It's 32. And the Shirelles, they're one of my." So he said, "No, I don't mean that." He said, "You have a hit record." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "That demo you made of that song, The Pied Piper, went to number one in LA. And Sonny Bono fell in love with it. And Sonny and Cher had three records in the top 10 at that point." And he said, "And they want you to go on their tour in 3 weeks." I said, "I never toured. I played in the symphony orchestra. I played a little jazz sometimes." He said, "No, it's a 30-city tour." And and it was interesting too, because Corey Wells was the backup band and he became Three Dog Night. And on that tour is where he met Danny Hutton, because Danny was the opening act. And yeah, there was so all of a sudden there I was booked to go on a Sonny and Cher tour. So I had helped sign John Sebastian in a spoonful. So I went to John. I said, "John, what do I wear on a rock tour?" I said, "I don't even have the clothes to wear. I don't hang out in the village. I said, "I hang out with my wife and daughter." Anyway, so John took me to the village and got me a hat and a shirt to wear. So there I was, a hippie now. And the only hippie that was president of his class in college.
I love it. Well, I want to ask you about the trades because everybody knows Billboard today, but you mentioned Cashbox, and back in the 60s and even in the 70s, Cashbox was a real strong competitor to
Yeah,
Billboard. Of course,
George
George
Albert owned
Albert
it.
hired
But
me. I was the executive vice president of Cashbox in the 80s.
well, he was a friend of mine. He had
Oh,
that
great.
limousine, right?
We
Remember he
called
had
him
the license
GA.
plate? Yeah, that's
Smoke
right.
cigars and cuss like a sailor.
Right. Did you ever see his Rolls Royce with the license
I
plates
used
and
to
cash?
park right next to him downstairs under
Yeah,
Cashbox.
the license plate like said gas box or something. I
Yeah.
remember. Last time I saw him was outside of the House of Blues in L.A.
Oh, wow.
That's
Yeah, he
crazy.
every Friday he would go to his house in Palm Springs. Always had Friday off. But he was a
Yeah,
character, and unfortunately, Billboard became the VHS to Cashbox Beta, and you know, George, as you know, was kind of stick in the mud. He wanted things his way, and he wasn't really up with all the new technology and how people were telling him it had to be.
Yeah, well, a friend of mine started Record World,
Yeah.
and that sort of became the place where you could go to because you could get him to move a record up when it was going down. Back in those days, the charts read, and you remember the Rodman sheet?
Oh, sure.
Everybody lived by
No,
the Rodman
everybody
sheet.
lived and died by those charts every week, you know?
Yeah, and my vice president of my company was Buzz Bennett, who was a guy who started FM radio.
Oh, wow.
He was voted the program director of the year, 8 years, and he was working with me, and it just happened. And then what happened was Charlie and Don and Kirshner were always pushing my songs. So I wrote with Jerry Goffin, and I wrote 3 songs on the Cookies album, where the Beatles got chains from. So I
Wow.
was on that. I had about in my best moment, I had about 15 songs in the top 100 in Cashbox.
That's
And I
amazing
was really
times.
proud. Yeah, you know what? The odds were so hard to get there. You know that
Oh, yeah.
people that were
Everybody was
hanging.
fighting to get on that chart.
Yeah, people were walking the streets just hoping to get one song recorded. In my first year, I had about 45 records come out. It was just natural for me, you know. I guess
Okay.